Rajani Katta, author of the MMI book, and in today's video I wanted to talk about a particular type of CASPer exam question called a behavioral interview question. Behavioral interview questions have been used for a long time in the business world, but they are increasingly being used in the setting of other professional school exams or interviews. And how do you recognize a behavioral interview question? Well, classically, they start out with, tell me about a time when. It might encompass a whole lot of different situations. Tell me about a time when you experienced a conflict with a colleague. Tell me about a time when you had to make a sacrifice in order to reach a goal. Tell me about a time when you had to speak up to someone in a position of authority. There are actually a number of behavioral interview questions. I mean, really, it's almost an infinite number of behavioral interview questions. But basically, the reason that they're used is because it is believed that past behavior can be a predictor of future behavior. So that's typically why these questions are asked. And I'm focusing here on the CASPer exam, but behavioral interview questions can also be asked in the setting of a traditional medical school interview. They are often asked as well in the setting of an MMI. So in a traditional medical school interview, you'll be sitting across from an interviewer and they'll just ask you, well, tell me about a time when you experienced a conflict. In the setting of an MMI, you'll walk up to the door and there'll just be a prompt that's written on a piece of paper that's on the door, and you'll be able to read it and then have a few minutes to think about that prompt. And then you will walk into the room and you'll discuss it with your interviewer. In the setting of a CASPer exam, there's sort of two different ways that this might play out. You will typically read this question on your screen. So, tell me about a time when you had to make a sacrifice in order to reach a goal. And if you are asked to give a text response, you will be given 30 seconds to think about this question, and then your 3 questions will pop up on the screen and you'll have 5 minutes to type out your response. Another version might be that you are asked to give a video response to this question. So you will read the question on your screen, and then you'll have 10 seconds, then you will have a question pop up on your screen. Briefly describe the situation. And then you'll have 10 seconds to think about it, and then you'll have 1 minute to record your video response. So let's back up for a moment and just talk about behavioral interview questions in general. How do you respond to a behavioral interview question, and what are they looking for? Well, I'm going to describe how I counsel my students if they're preparing for a traditional medical school interview and they're presented with a behavioral interview question. So I really talk about breaking this down into 3 parts. The first is, let's take the example of tell me about a time when you had to make a sacrifice in order to reach a goal. So the first step in this is to make an inventory of times when you had to make a sacrifice. The second step is to do a star table, which helps you sort of formulate how you're going to tell this story. And then the final step is lessons learned, to really tie it back to your future career. So let's start with that first one, which is making an inventory. It can be really hard to come up with examples for questions like this right on the spot. I mean, you might just have 10 seconds, or you might have 30 seconds to come up with an example. And this really goes back to my other video in this series where I talk about 10 strategies to help you prepare for the CASPer exam. One of those strategies is to create a story bank. And this is really helpful, to spend a couple of weeks just as you go about your day thinking about different stories that you can use that demonstrate certain situations. And how do you know what kind of stories to come up with? Well, we have a blog post where we talk about medical school, 350 common medical school interview questions. And one of those, and when you talk about those 350 medical school interview questions, those break down into about 30 parent questions. So it's not that you have to memorize responses to 350 questions. but it's helpful to look at those big 30 questions, and one of those questions is behavioral interview questions. So under the tell me about a time when, I have a lot of examples of different areas that you can start thinking about now. And as I said, it's really helpful to spend the next couple of weeks just as you go about your day. Maybe you have your note apps on your phone, or you actually carry around index cards, and you start writing down different examples of stories that demonstrate certain times in your life. And so that's something that's very helpful. Now, as you're faced with this question right in front of you, you want to do an inventory. And typically the ideal scenario to present here is one where you demonstrated motivation for a career, where you demonstrated self-awareness, where you demonstrated resilience. Those are all things, qualities, attributes that are being evaluated on the CASPer exam. So those are situations that would be ideal to bring up when you're doing your inventory. Now, the second part of answering this question is describing the situation. And this is where we recommend the STAR table. And that just means identify and explain the situation, the task, the actions that you took, and the result. Remember, with questions like this, you're telling a very short story. And remember, stories are more memorable. They highlight your unique characteristics. So it's really helpful to structure your story with that STAR approach. And then finally, you want to talk about lessons learned. So what did you learn from this particular situation that you can then apply to your future career? So let me give you a quick example of how I would approach a CASPer exam that asks a behavioral interview question. So tell me about a time when you had to make a sacrifice in order to achieve a goal. And I'm going to give you an example of a typed response. So this is going to be a lot shorter than if this were a 1-minute video response. So because this is a typed response, I've got 3 questions right off the bat, and I know what they're going to be. Briefly describe the sacrifice that you made. Do you regret the sacrifice? Why or why not? Were there any lessons that you learned that could be applied to your future career? Briefly describe the sacrifice that you made. When I was in high school, I received a full scholarship to an excellent college, but that was far away from my family. In order to attend, I would have to make the sacrifice of leaving my family. And not only would I leave my family, but I would no longer be able to care for my grandmother, and it would put a burden on my family and would be hard for me because I cared for her very deeply. Do you regret this sacrifice? Why or why not? I do not regret my decision because it has positioned me well as I'm applying for medical school. Having said that, I still am sad and miss my grandmother sometimes, but I was able to find a community outreach program that has helped to care for my grandmother in my absence. Did you learn anything that can be applied to your desired career? Yes, I learned that when presented with challenging decisions, it is rarely a yes or no decision. I learned that sometimes we can find creative solutions to problems. So that's an example of how I would approach a behavioral interview question on the CASPer exam. I want to point out a few quick things here. The first is that you have 3 questions when you are typing your response. Just go straight for the question that you feel the most comfortable answering. Again, you only have 5 minutes and that clock is ticking very fast. So if you're not sure how to answer one of the questions, just go straight to the one that you feel like you can answer. I went in order, but you don't have to. The other thing I want to point out is that I was trying to keep my answers really brief. Even though I'm speaking to them, even though I'm speaking them out loud, I'm thinking to myself, you only have about 3 to 5 sentences per question if you are a fast typist. And so that third question that I responded to, if I was speaking it, I would have kept going. But really, I was probably running out of time with the 5 minutes of typing. So it's okay that these responses are very brief. That's all you're going to have time for. And it's okay that I was probably cut off in the middle of my response to that third question, because again, the makers of the CASPer exam specifically state that it is okay if you are if you provide incomplete responses, that those will still be graded. So I want to take the same question, and I now want to give an example of a video response. And I have to say, I'm a lot less anxious about the video response because I have a minute in order to expand upon my response. It's really hard to give a good response in 3 to 5 sentences, but a minute I can do a lot more talking. So let's say the question flashes on the screen. Briefly describe the situation and the sacrifice that you made. And now I have 10 seconds to think about it. And now I'm going to record my 1-minute video response. Briefly describe the sacrifice that you made. When I was in high school, I was trying to decide on where to go to college. And I could either stay at my local college, or I was given the opportunity to attend my dream university on a full tuition scholarship. But attending that university was going to be a sacrifice, not only for myself, but for my family as well. For myself, because I was going to be I'm very close to my family, I would miss them, but I'm also one of the primary caretakers for my grandmother, and it was really pulling at me. How could I leave her? But, and I had to think about it a lot, but I was able to find a community outreach program that was able to help take over some of that caretaking duties for my grandmother. And so I was able to attend my dream university. But even when I was there, I have to say it really felt like a sacrifice because I was pulled away from my family, and it did feel like there were trade-offs. Do you regret this sacrifice? Why or why not? I do not regret my sacrifice, mainly because it has positioned me extremely well for applying to medical school. I had certain professional opportunities and the ability to work with 2 mentors that I would not have had in any other setting. So I don't regret my sacrifice. I still, however, recognize that there were a lot of trade-offs, and I do miss my family, and especially my grandmother, quite a bit. But I have to say, once I got to college, I realized that there were a lot of ways that I could still stay in touch with my family and stay connected and still provide a lot of help. So we did set up regular FaceTime meetings, and my grandmother and I had a new routine where I would read to her every evening. So ultimately, although there were trade-offs, I don't regret my sacrifice. Did you learn anything that can be applied to your desired career? I learned a lot from having to go through this challenging decision-making process. And one of the main things I learned was that it is rare that there is a true binary decision. So it's often not a yes or no. And it really taught me a lot about creative problem solving and trying to find alternate solutions to problems. And it really pushed me, for years I had been the primary caretaker for my grandmother, but it really pushed me and my family to try to find alternative solutions. And I really learned that creative problem solving was something that could be applied to so many areas in my personal and professional life. And I think that key realization that it rarely comes down to a yes or no decision, but that you can sometimes find alternatives, is something that I will carry with me through the rest of my career. So that was a good compare and contrast, I think, between what it's like to do a text response, where you're very time pressured, and a video response where that 1 minute to answer a question allows you to say a lot more and provide a fuller response. But you have to be prepared to do both on the CASPer exam. And I think I want to do one final scenario just to give you a little bit, just another example. So I'll go back to the original question, which is, tell me about a time when you had to make a sacrifice in order to achieve your goals. And I'm going to do video responses here because that's a lot easier. Briefly describe the sacrifice that you made. When I was a freshman in college, I was able to join an organization. It was a fantastic organization. I'm very passionate about biking, and this organization every summer, well, they train for months in order to every summer do a 1,000-mile bike ride across the country to raise funds for our local children's hospital. But in the spring semester of my freshman year, I had to change my major. And in order to succeed in my new major, it would be very important and helpful to do an internship in that area. So I had to make this decision: do I do the internship, or do I sacrifice the months of intense training that I had already done for the bike ride? And I ultimately decided that I needed to succeed in my new major to set me up for success when I was applying to professional school. So I did end up sacrificing the bike ride in order to do the internship. Do you regret this sacrifice? Why or why not? I do not regret my sacrifice, even though I had a lot of angst about it right at the time. And I don't regret my sacrifice because that internship that I did this summer after my freshman year really connected me to two very important mentors who have been instrumental in my ongoing success in that degree program. And the other thing I realized is that even though I had to sacrifice that summer bike ride, and I had been training so hard, that it didn't discount the training. I mean, the training itself was pretty amazing, and I made some wonderful friends. And in fact, I was able to do a similar bike ride over the Christmas holidays. So I was able to use my training in another setting. So ultimately, I think it was the right decision for me, and I do not regret my sacrifice. Did you learn anything that can be applied to your desired career? That was a very difficult decision for me at the time, but I think I learned some very important factors that are going to help me as I approach medical school. One of which is that yes, sometimes sacrifices have to be made in order to reach your ultimate goal, but that the time I spent preparing for that bike ride was not wasted effort. It was actually something very meaningful to me. So the process was very important, and in fact, probably was even more important than my goal of riding the 1,000 miles across the US. But in addition to that, I also, it also taught me about creative problem solving and how important it was to try to find other ways to reach both my goals, that it often in life is not an either or, that sometimes it can be both, but sometimes that might look a little different than what I had originally envisioned. And so the fact that I was able to find another way to complete my bike ride was a really important lesson for me as well. So those were 3 different examples of how you might respond to a behavioral interview question on the CASPer exam question. A text-based response versus a video response, and then just an additional video response. And if you would like to see more examples of behavioral interview questions, I'll direct you to our blog at thesuccessfulmatch.com. You can see our blog post there about the 350 common medical school interview questions. It has a lot of different variations of behavioral interview questions. And then we also have blog posts specifically on how to respond to behavioral interview questions, if you'd like to read more about it. So please feel free to check out the other videos in this series or our blog post. And if you're taking the CASPer exam this year, I wish you the best of luck.